Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Esoteric Survivalist. We've been talking about the yoga aphorisms of Patanjali. Essentially, it's a roadmap that esoteric survivalism can emulate without going into great detail. There are some basic points that we can follow without going into intense training or any kind of great elaborate commitment on our time and energy, because esoteric survivalism isn't going out into the wilderness and using esoteric means to survive. It is essentially being in real life, in the real world, where the esoteric dimension is repressed, and using that repressed dimension, unrepressing it essentially, enough to be able to smooth the rough edges of life. Let's put it that way. Of course, there can be more, but this is not what I would be claiming. Essentially, this can give somebody a fighting chance. It could probably give them a hell of a lot more than a fighting chance, but let's look at it in a clear manner. We're speaking first, working from the ground up, and that's not from the ground or the root center or the primitive emotions and all of that. This is from the mind itself that we all have access to. So we're working through our own left brain slanted reasoning mind. And what we're doing is creating a set of reference points and principles that reinforce each other. Essentially, the principles themselves, which constitute a source of discernment. There are certain aspects of relating the cognitive mind, the mentality, with the emotional mind. And these facilitate the deeper exercises to be able to shift awareness focus, what Carlos Castaneda might call the assemblage point. It's not quite the same, but Carlos Castaneda, who was an author of metaphysical books chronicling the apprenticeship of young Carlitos or himself or his own persona to a Central American shaman named Don Juan. Anyways, what he was saying essentially was that these shamans perceived lines of force moving through every entity and the universe as a whole, and even the central principle of the universe, and they converge in every human body at a certain point where the reality is defined. If you move the assemblage point even a little bit, you alter the reality. So if, for example, you are an addictive personality and you move your assemblage point, it can be easier to relieve the addiction. Or if you have a certain obsession, if you move the assemblage point, that obsession won't be there anymore, because all of your life force, all of your essence, your awareness it has a different reference frame. So this works well in this kind of formulation because we are shifting our focus of understanding, of cognition. We're shifting it more to the center. That means that the intuitive side, the holistic side, and the analytical side, which is also the verbal and critical side, these two sides come into balance, which means they have a more or less equal contribution. Some cases, balance can lead to stagnation. Some cases, it actually enhances everything. This is one of those cases. So what yoga is asking is that, well, when you shift your focus more toward that center, when you honor the intuitive more, and then the rational mind can actually think more clearly because it's not taxed. It's because of the excessive demands made upon it. And it is actually supported by the intuition. But that means you need to orient to the world in a different manner. I mean, everything changes when you shift your awareness that way, and it doesn't change automatically. In addition, other people around you may react negatively or neutrally or positively. It depends. You'll pretty much know what their motives are by how they react, by how they've adapted to the dynamic between you. We all relate to everything in the world, and that relationship has its own set of patterns. When those are disrupted, without the consent of one of the parties, that party feels offended. This is especially with humans. That doesn't mean we shouldn't disrupt them. They may be unhealthy, and somebody else might be benefiting from the fact that we're living unhealthy patterns. They might be adapted to that. That's how they deal with things. In terms of esoteric survivalism, that is not our problem. At this point, we are learning to establish a natural discernment that develops through hemispheric balancing. And I'm not talking about listening to certain acoustic tones or using your headphones and those kind of methods. I would consider those auxiliary. The main focus is always our own awareness and how we relate to it, our own initiative. This doesn't mean there's no help and there's no complementation or there's no support. All of these come as we find them, however, as we search for them, as we open to them. And that means our perception needs to clarify. So clarifying the perception begins in yoga by addressing a state called avidya, which is translated as ignorance, but essentially means lack of vision. And that also means lack of discernment, lack of understanding. Anything that around us does not really compute as it should. So we're off. As we try to calibrate ourselves back into a central state, and that's where the metaphysical side of yoga begins, that we will get into with the ni-yamas, which are the or underlying disciplines. And these niyamas are essentially a preparation for the proper application of the 8 limbs. That's the second limb themselves. And then we move into our stance and energy work and mastering the 5 senses, which essentially uses sense impressions as references to tune into what consciousness is. When you are aware of the full sensory impact of seeing, then it impacts your own sense of being. These things are connected. And hearing, the same way. The more primitive the sense, something like hearing, for example, is far more spiritually potent than even seeing. But each sense has its own, senses like smell and taste might be more limited. And correlating the senses with different principles, energies, and elements, that comes later. What we want to do now is develop a certain sense of discernment through the cognitive mind, which is essentially through the mind we all have access to. You don't have to be a nerd or even intelligent here, just basically aware and motivated, because the Yoga Sutras themselves say that one of the most important things here is commitment, is your passion. It isn't some kind of dispassionate, I don't care attitude. Here, all of your focus lies in the commitment to transcend your conditioned state and reverse the state from ignorance into being aware. And that means being turned on in terms of your mind reaching toward the essence of the consciousness, which is the spirit, and then transforming that within your own embodiment. That changes your life. And we'll explain how. But for now, we have a sequence that begins with eliminating presumption to establish a state where any kind of dogmatism or relativistic thinking is identified. It doesn't mean it's wrong or you should throw it out. It's just, okay, this is where I'm being relative and I'm making conjecture. But is this conjecture pure conjecture because my intuition is shut down? Or is it based on information coming from a different pathway that is processed differently, not analytically, but holistically? So it might be nonverbal, and it might be an abstract pattern recognition effect that ties into the emotions, a feeling, a gut, something. Well, this kind of thing is the beginning of discernment. And as you untangle the tendency to jump to conclusions because of assumptions, presumptions, a priori data, whatever may preoccupy you, even hidden subconscious motives that things turn out a certain way. Once these motives are addressed, it doesn't mean they have to be thrown out. They can't be if they're part of you. They're just misunderstood. So they need to be reformulated, and the negatives need to be taken out. The things that torture you need to be taken out. So they need to come into their own. What do you really want? Right now, the desire might be corrupt. There might be the suffering. There might be confusion. There might be all kinds of preconceptions that are limiting. Many people, all of us, to some degree, live, even unconsciously, in a certain state of feeling threatened all the time, that we always have to watch our own back or somebody else has to watch our back. This is not the state that a human being should live in, because a human being is constructed esoterically, at least, and maybe more subtly in the physical or psychophysical sense. They're constructed in order to live in a world where they are autonomous, where the world and the human being are in a relationship that is sustainable, wonderful, ideal, and ever creatively evolving. And it is supposed to be based on love, so it is always a fantastic experience. That is how it should be, or how it was meant to be, or how we might like it to be if we're not psychopathic and full of vengeful, destructive, hidden rage, or however you want to identify it. So the first thing you do is you reclaim your mind. You don't silence it. You don't throw it out the window. You reclaim your mind and you realize that your ethics are not certain rules that some authority has imposed upon you. Your ethics are actually your own standards of referencing yourself in relationship to the world that can lead to a sustainable relationship with the world. They are just the beginning. Being an indifferent a-hole is not the way to manifest or express moral principles. It isn't also to pretend to be happy all the time. I mean, this does not interfere with your humanity. These are reference boundaries of relationship, of how you relate to yourself, how you express yourself in relationship to the world. And then this sends a ping back. Some people call this karma, but it really isn't. It is the world's response to you. And so that response is something that often is misinterpreted. Often it's judged. So a situation where you're not in discernment is a situation that can establish a judgment, which is a conjectural argument, and judgments like that can lead to suffering. They lead to repression. Repression leads to violence. So when you're able to cease presuming without falling into the presumption of not presuming even, then you are free of violence because there's no reason for it. You know you don't want to be violent. Unless you're a psychopath who has motives to be consciously violent, you can actually help yourself from falling into those traps, maybe the violent attitudes of other people. And then what this does is lead to being genuine, knowing that being honest with yourself and genuine with others, which doesn't mean opening up your insides and spilling your guts all the time. It just means that, okay, what I'm doing, I'm conscious of it. Whatever I do, the lies are not going to permeate my life. But when I relate to other people and I know that they're hostile to me, I do need to protect myself in any shape or form in the environment. If I don't feel secure, I do need to protect myself, even for my own well-being, my psychological well-being. So will I go to extremes? Because a lot of people use this to justify corrupt motives and other things where they don't have ethical reference points. So your ethical reference points are essentially pragmatic. They're practical means of relating to the world. And being genuine is something between you and yourself that spills over into the world, into your environment. Like, this is who I am. But if your environment is repressive, then things are a little more complicated, and that's where esoteric survivalism comes in. So being genuine here is not a blanket excuse for just taking away your boundaries. In fact, that is part of who you are and part of how you want to be, more importantly, is to have boundaries and to be able to expand them accordingly in a way that is sustainable with the environment. Because the environment is not the enemy. The environment may sustain enmity, and it may be corrupt, twisted, repressed, dysfunctional something, but it is not the enemy by nature. So there is a remedy, in other words, and that is what esotericists and religious people call salvation. It is so significant, it is described as salvation. However, we're not getting religious here. Right now, we're going into a certain sequence of removing presumption so we don't fall into traps of losing our energy, losing our life force, losing our dignity, going into violation scenarios of self or other people. And we realize we can be authentic. And when we are authentic, people trust us. And so we get more responsibility, and authenticity then finds its true groove. This is an evolving trait. Authenticity leads to the respect of our boundaries and the respect of other people's boundaries. However, those boundaries need to be recognized 100% for what they are and how they move. We cannot have somebody telling us that they are creating boundaries when they're secretly manipulating us or trying to, because we will be discerning enough to detect it. So we need to act accordingly, but this action must be based on compassion, not as a moral principle, but as a result of being genuine. So when we do that and we are genuine and we can respect our own boundaries and we don't feel like we're going to be accosted or robbed or victimized, and we don't need to do anything like that with other people, and we are very acutely aware of the situations involved with these things, we can move to the next step of actually addressing life in a sustainable manner. This is a manner where we are respectful, where we have a code of conduct and ethics that summarizes the whole thing, because the yamas aren't really a code of ethics, even though I expressed it that way. They are they are principles of behavior. However, the one principle that sums them all up is brahmacharya, which is essentially conduct in the way that is respectful and emulating of the nature of Brahma. Now, this can be the macrocosm creation, but more than likely it is the more restricted god, the deity Brahma, who is the consort of Sarasvati, the goddess of the arts and education and music. And so this deity is the deity of sustainable civilization, of sustainable society, of sustainable ethics. And it is also the creator deity. So it is the deity that forms these things. So this is all about mental creativity. It is also about the awareness of propriety. All this knowledge in the sense of boundaries that we have from being genuine, that we have from being free of preconceptions. All of these things with our evolving discernment lead to a trust. Once we can actually look into the world and study it and be educated and become mature mentally, so to speak, and thoughtful. This is part of brahmacharya. This is a sort of purity that is beyond sexual abstinence. It cannot be restricted to sexual abstinence because the God himself is a God of creation, and he had a consort, and he had a daughter. And in fact, there's a story of an aspect of Shiva that punished him because his fifth head, because he had 5 heads, wanted to. So things aren't so clear cut, but brahmacharya is to be a proper person in society, not according to social etiquette or whatever, but in a sense that's sustainable in your world so you don't have to deal with it. That means you don't have to be a revolutionary outwardly uh, until you go far deeper and you know the time is right. If I'm speaking metaphorically here because we're dealing with esoteric survivalism. And that means we're going to deal with the basics to be able to have a certain sense. And in this case, it's paradoxical because the last yama after brahmacharya is a sense of trust where you don't have to grasp everything, where you don't have to hold on, where you don't have to feel defensive, where you can start trusting life, but coming from a position of knowledge, and not information knowledge, but knowledge, perception knowledge, knowledge of presence, knowledge of who you are, not conceptually, but as a state of being. You're honest with yourself so that and you're aware of your boundaries, and that creates a condition where things automatically make sense in a more coherent and natural way. So you can trust because you're aware enough to trust, and the trust isn't blind, just like faith isn't blind. It's just a different, deeper form of perception, where your usual, typical thought process and perception don't consider it. But now you've expanded. It's like opening the door to another room in your house. It's still a room in your house. You just haven't been to the east side, for example, of the house. It's been locked away. And that's where the sun comes in the morning. So once you reach that state of trust, your principles will cycle and lead you deeper, if you commit, of course, to what we might call a path of seeking, where you can go deeper and then you can move into altering your psycho-emotional makeup in a more consistent manner. And that's what we're going to explore with the ni-yamas, which are the sub-disciplines, the underlying ones. And the first one is psychosomatic hygiene. We can leave the somatic hygiene because it's basically saying, well, you be clean and healthy and take your baths and, scrub under the fingernails. But essentially, it begins with your psychic immune system. So yoga itself introduces the psychic immune system, but in a very veiled manner. So after this, we move into a state of, okay, I'm free of the pressure of all this insanity that was coming from the outside. And so I'm able to relax, and I'm able almost to be content in the moment. Not happy, euphoric, but content, and possibly even touching upon a natural joy that exists just under the layer of realism, cynicism, suffering that often refuses to see it. And we can't because we're too polarized into a part of our minds that processes information in a way that breaks it down too much and leaves us with dust in our mouths. So we don't want to eliminate it, but we want to bring it to a point where it is functional again, and functional that it doesn't burn itself out while the other side of us atrophies, or maybe in reverse, where we have whole split personalities that are using the right brain to conceal themselves in nonverbal abstraction. So after this overview, in the next video, we're going to go into the next part of the sequence, which is the niyamas. And I'm stopping at the second one because the next three are actually considered the yoga of words, the yoga of action. They are a bundle of practices or attitudes or focuses of awareness, let's put it that way, that essentially constitute the essence of what yoga is when combined into one. And this mirrors the much later combination of three limbs of yoga, which is the limb of concentration, the limb of meditation, and the limb of actualization or realization, which is samadhi. And we shall talk about these things, giving an overview in the next one. uh, basically focusing on the ni-yamas. But the ni-yamas are practices that we can still scale down. And they also represent the meeting point between what we call level one, the psychological individualized level, and the relationship with the environment, which is level two. And that level is essentially where psychic perception begins. Because when you're in your own self, it's still, you're in your head. You don't, it is psychic perception, but it's more in your head. When you relate to the world, and I don't just mean with the five senses, it is beyond that. And we shall talk about that next time. For now, thank you for listening. Check out the Substack site, please. It's on below. You would like the articles if you like this stuff. And even the podcast, which is getting a revamping. So without further ado, thank you for listening. Magus out.